I guess the legacy media probably worked that out by having people, mediators, right, and guests. And that was also back when we could rely on the structures of authority in some sense to filter. And now we're in this helter-skelter world where everything is
The
up
legacy
for
media
grabs.
is the worst at that now.
Yeah, I know.
They're the worst
I
at
know.
that, which is fascinating. You know, it really is. It's really fascinating when you lose faith in a New York Times piece. You know, it's like you go like, well, this is bullshit.
Yeah.
I know this. I know what they're doing. I know
Yeah.
they're just, this is editorial bullshit. And that didn't used to be the case, I don't think.
No,
But
it didn't.
But then I go back to like what I learned about the Woodward, Bernstein, Nixon thing at Watergate. That was all essentially an intelligence operation. Have you ever looked into that? You know, I had Bill Murray on the podcast, and Bill Murray said one of the wildest things. He read the first 5 pages of Bob Woodward's biography on John Belushi, Wired. He read the first 5 pages, like, he goes, "Oh my God, they framed Nixon."
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, no
He's
kidding.
like, what they wrote about my friend was so not true. It was so wildly off. He said John Belushi was a lightweight. John Belushi would have a couple of drinks and he'd be fucked up. He wasn't like a big partier. That time he did that speedball is probably the only time he ever did it in his life. But Woodward had him painted as this maniacal, off the rails, just drug-addled monster. And he knew that to not be true. He was very close to Belushi for a long time. And so he was like, oh my God, they framed Nixon. And then when I told him the whole story, you know, what Tucker Carlson had told me about Woodward being an intelligence asset, and then that was his first job ever as a journalist was Watergate, and that there's FBI guys that were involved in it and the break-in, and the whole thing was they tried to get Nixon out of there, the most popular president in the history of the country in terms of the vote, and they were successful. They got him out of there, and it's probably likely because Nixon was very concerned with who killed Kennedy, and he wanted to find out, and he wanted to get that information out, and apparently he had been talking about it. I know who did it, and he was, you know, he didn't want it happening to him, obviously, and he knew it could. If you're a president, you know, a couple of guys ago, you know, just one of the most popular presidents, at least posthumously popular presidents. I know he was very polarizing while he was in office, but was shot in the head in the middle of Dallas, and you think that the government might have had something to do with it. Like that could fuck with your head, obviously. You know?
Yeah, well, there's many things like that. I mean, you saw the government website that came up 2 days ago about COVID?
Yes.
Okay.
Wild. Wild
Yeah,
to see that.
that's for sure. What are you supposed to do with that?
All the things that would have gotten you fired if you were a professor
and obtain status in consequence. They're Christ's number one enemies in the Gospels, by the way, those people. They're the ones who conspire to crucify him, right? The religious pretenders.
Right.
So this has been going on for a very long period of time. So the climate apocalypse narrative is perfectly situated to, what would you say, to serve the purposes of the narcissists, the Machiavellians, the psychopaths and the sadists, because it's a infinitely expanding existential threat that can be used as an excuse for anything.
Yes.
Right? And it also provides a perfect cloak for any amount of power maneuvering. It's like, I want to make your shower heads put out a needle spray so that you're cold all the time while you have a shower, while you're doing something you do every day that could otherwise be highly enjoyable. Why do I get to invade your life to that degree? Well, because the planet's at stake, Joe. And who are you to privilege your shower comfort, something that trivial, over the fate of the entire planet? Well, you can use that argument at every single level. You know, Trump came out with this executive statement just a few days ago about shower heads, and everybody kind of laughed about that. And I thought, no, he has an eye for petty tyranny, right? For petty tyranny. And there's very little that's more petty than, well, I think the showerhead example is a perfect one.
Yeah.
And then you also think, look, if they're willing to control your life at that level of detail, what are they not willing to control? It's like, you're concerned about my shower heads? Like we're out of water, which
Right.
we're not at all? So what won't you control? So you think, well, the psychopaths are edge cases. They'll move wherever the power is. They find a narrative that can be used to strike fear in the hearts of people and to justify compulsion. They ally themselves with that belief claim, and then they ratchet themselves up status hierarchies without any true reputational validity, riding on that edge of fear and power. Right, right. I wrote an article, it hasn't been published yet, in the Telegraph, because I got hell a lot after one of our podcasts. You may know this, but
The climate change stuff.
that's right. The whole bloody transcript was sent to the college as an indication that I was out of my wheelhouse. And maybe I stepped a bit out of my wheelhouse when we had that discussion, because I'm not a climate scientist, whatever the hell that is, by the way, because you have to know a lot to be a climate scientist and an economist on top of that. So today I'm talking about something that's a lot more psychological. The climate apocalypse narrative is a social contagion that's driven by power-mad psychopaths who are hell-bent on using fear and compulsion to make sure everyone steps in line so that they can continue with their acquisition of undeserved power.
It's also effective enough that the people that are underneath the power comply and do the job of the man for the man.
Yeah, well, that's the advantage of using fear and compulsion,
Yes.
right? It's like, well, I have to go along with this because my leaders who had built up a certain degree of credibility are telling me that, the apocalypse is nigh. And who am I to, well, first of all, question, because, God, there's a hard thing to figure out. What's the global effect of human activity on the climate for the next 100 years? Well, good luck figuring that out. But this is why I'm making it more psychological this time. It's like the climate fluctuates, and for complex reasons. But that doesn't mean that you get to look 100 years into the future and you get to conjure up an apocalyptic narrative, and you get to say, we're the only people that can save you, and you get to say, you have to change every single thing you do in your life and prioritize our concern above all else, including even the well-being of your own children, or the economic future of the Africans, for example, who don't get to use fossil fuels, right? You don't get to do that. You don't get to do that using fear and compulsion.
Not only that, it's being done by people who have been wrong about everything, every step of the way. Every step of the way.
Yeah, well, then they just play a sleight of hand game there, though. Okay, we got the time frame wrong, Joe. It's not 20 years.
But it's not even just
40
that.
years.
It's not even just climate change. It's basically everything. Public health, agriculture, you name it.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah, well, that
Every
sets
single
us,
thing. The water supply.
that
everything.
sets us back into this conundrum that you and Douglas and Dave were addressing. It's like, okay, two conundrums, like three. How do you pursue your interest in a landscape that's been shorn of reliable expert input? Right? Who do you rely on?
Right.
Okay. If you don't know who to rely on, like, how do you keep the bloody psychopaths at bay?
Right.
And the conspiracy theorist mongers and the people who aren't trying to discover the truth, but who are using the conspiratorial edge, let's say.
The grifters.
The groypers, for that matter, right? These are people who are clearly playing power games for their own benefit, and they're spinning up these conspiratorial narratives and riding on them and occupying them in this parasitical manner. There's going to be this is a huge problem already on the right-wing side. I don't even know what the hell that is anymore, because I don't know what the left is, and I don't know what the right is, but
we need to claim the center.
Yeah, well, that's also what we're trying to do with ARC. It's like, what is the center, right?
The center is a kind of where we can all meet up.
Well,
and I think that.
What is the center? Yeah, well, the left is, and I don't know what the right is, but
we need to claim the center.
Yeah, well, that's also what we're trying to do with ARC. It's like, what is the center, right?
The center is a kind of where we can all meet up.
Well,
and I think that's doable.
Well, let's specify it even more.
Okay.
The center is a place you'd go if you were invited. Right? Right, exactly.
Right.
Well, and that also ties back into this idea of play. Like Piaget figured this out when he was watching little kids. So if a little boy wants to play house with a little girl, which is generally a good idea, if you want to play house with a woman at some point in your life, you better get that right. It's a very serious game. What's the first rule? She has to want to play. Right. What's the second rule? You have to play with her in a manner that makes her want to play with you again. Right? I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of what constitutes objective standards of morality. You know how Sam Harris was obsessed with malevolence, and he wanted to ground morality in objective science because he thought that would give us a firm standing place. But he went down the wrong scientific rabbit hole, I think. I think if you understand this relationship with play and iteration, then you have the core of morality. And Piaget, by the way, this is part of, what would you say? This is the philosophical edge of his theory. This is actually what he was trying to accomplish. How do you decide if an arrangement is good versus bad or good versus evil? Well, Piaget went to children to find that out. It's like, okay, you want to set up a game. Why? Well, a game is the first social, it's the foundation of social interaction, right? You play a game with one other one other person, and then maybe you can play a game with a bunch of people, and then you can play a game with one person or a bunch of people across a long period of time, and then you could do it in a way that improves. Okay, so what are the rules? If you're a little boy, she has to want to play. And then you have to play with her in a way so that she wants to play with you again. If you do that, then you have a friend. And that iterates. Now, so you can imagine that there's a structure of voluntary play that's really quite stringent. But this is what you do on your podcast. Seriously. And that's why it's so attractive to people. And that's the core of what you might call objective morality. It's like there's a very limited number of ways to play, to offer a game that someone else wants to play. And then there's a very limited number of ways to play that game so that they want to keep playing with you. And then you could, if you add that additional constraint of improvement across the games, you've got the straight and narrow path. Right? And then it's marked by, we're really trying to do this at ARC. We want to offer a vision that people want to accept or even thrilled to accept, because that's even better, right? A game that you'd be thrilled to play. So one of the things we're doing on the energy side, I'm going to an event with Alex Epstein here in 2 days, talk to energy executives about this. Well, what kind of world do you want to see? Well, how about a world where there's so much energy that poor people can afford it? How'd that be for a vision? Like, have you got a problem with that? Well, poor people can't have energy because that'll destroy the planet. It's like, no, poor people can't have that energy because you'd have to let go of the game that you're playing as a narcissistic psychopath that's elevating your status inappropriately, and you're perfectly willing to sacrifice the world's poor to continue your grip on power. How about that for a psychological interpretation?
Right.
And how about this as an alternative? Why don't we do everything we can to drive energy costs down to the lowest degree that's sustainable, like in a market economy, and make energy available to everyone so that we eradicate absolute poverty? Why wouldn't the left line up again around that? Because the left hypothetically serves the poor. It's like, nothing serves the poor better than an ethos first. We've got to get that right because we're also interested in getting the story right. But after that, on the material side, there's nothing more important than
but can I
cheap
stop
energy.
you for a second there? I don't think people on the left are getting that message. I don't think they're hearing that this is exactly what third world countries need, is a reliable source of energy and industry to elevate themselves out of poverty.
They're not.
They're not getting that, but it's not the problem of the people that are on the left, like the general followers.
Well, it might be a problem that's facilitated by the psychopathic fringe types. Like, look, I think
It's not offered to them, is my point.
yeah, the question is why not? And the reason is, like, this is part of you talked to Lomberg, right, to Bjorn. And
Yeah.
Bjorn's pretty good on this, or very good on this, I should say,
Yes.
to give him credit. And he would like to see a world where, and he's part of ARC, he'd like to see a world where we make energy abundance a top priority.
It's probably the only way you're going to pull third world countries out of dire poverty.
Well, it's also, as far as I can tell, the only way that you pull them out of environmental catastrophe.
Right.
Because if you want to produce an environmental catastrophe, a true environmental catastrophe, how about a 3 or 4 year famine? So that everyone there kills all the animals, for example, or dies, right? So we also know that if you get people above $5,000 a year GDP, then they start paying attention to long-term environmental sustainability because they don't have to scrabble around in the dirt for their next meal. So then we could say, well, how about we have a future of sufficient abundance so that no one is deprived of energy or opportunity for their children?
Right.
Well, that sounds like an invitation. Now, if you hate people and you think the industrial enterprise is a stain on the planet and that we're viruses or cancer on the planet, then you're going to have a problem with that. But my sense, too, is that if we had enough energy, We could make all the deserts bloom.
I was watching a video on pollution in India about the amount of garbage that gets thrown in rivers in India. And it was staggering, just staggering to watch that somehow or another because the population is so large and there's so many poor people and there's a lack of hope, whatever it is, they're just throwing their garbage in the rivers. And the rivers are just overwhelmed with garbage. If there's ever like a symbol of people that have been led the wrong way, like bad leadership, bad planning,
Bad underlying story.
everything, that's it. When you look in your river and it's all you see is water bottles, all you see is floating plastic. That's the whole river. And you know that if you get in that water, you're going to get sick. And yet, no one looks at it as this number one priority. Like, what do you always say? Clean your room, make your bed. Like, right? Yeah. What's going on? Like,
Well, and you want to incentivize people to pay attention to their local environment. And you do that in part by ensuring that they're not living so close to the edge of catastrophe that they can only think about today.
Right.
And if you start from the mindset that, can I tell you another story?
sure.
Okay.
You tell me all the stories. You don't have to
right.
ask questions.
All right. This is a really cool story.
Okay.
This is how to set the world right, this story. So I've been traveling around lecturing about my book, and I wrote a chapter on Abraham in that book. And Abraham is the father of, in principle, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, right? He's the father of nations. That's how the story goes. So when God comes to Abraham in a very particular way, it's one of the ways God is characterized in the Old Testament. So this is like a definition of God, right? It's not a testament to God. It's a definition of what God is. Okay, so Abraham, he doesn't hear anything about God till he's like 70. And he's already living in privileged paradise because his father and his mother are rich. And so he doesn't have to lift a finger. If life is about having your needs met, Abraham's got it covered. And so he lives like a satiated infant till he's 70. And then a voice comes to him and it says, you are required by the God of your ancestors to leave your zone of comfort, to leave the wealth of your father, to leave your nation, to leave your language, to go out into the world and have your terrible adventure. And if you do that, so now imagine that's the call to adventure. If you do that, these things will happen. This is the covenant that God makes to the Abrahamic people. It's so cool. I just talked to Brett Weinstein about this from an evolutionary biological perspective on the road because I wanted him to evaluate the story I'm going to tell you from an evolutionary perspective. So God is the voice that says to Abraham, if you follow the call of adventure, you'll be a blessing to yourself. So that's the meaning of life, right? To have the adventure. You'll do this in a way.
Blessing to yourself.
Yeah, because the adventure is compelling. Responsible romantic adventure is the most compelling pathway, right? And if it's intense enough, it justifies the suffering. Right? It's a reason to get up in the morning, even if you're in pain. Okay, then he says, there's another thing that'll happen too, which is that your name will become known among your people for valid reasons. So that's that genuine reputation that we talked about. So if you follow the pattern of adventure properly, you'll be a blessing to yourself and your name will become known among your people for valid reasons. So that's a good deal. You'll do this in a way that will maximize the probability that you'll establish something of permanence or even eternal permanence. So Abraham is offered, if he accepts the call and makes the proper sacrifices along the way, God says your descendants will outnumber the stars. So he establishes the pattern of fatherhood that best propagates down the generations, which is the same as following the pathway of adventure. Then he says, you'll do this in a way that will make sure no one can stand before you, right? So that if you adhere to that adventurous spirit and you propagate it, all enemies will either be converted into friends or flee before you. And then you'll do it in a way that brings abundance to everyone. And so now, Matt, this is the question I'd ask Brett. So imagine this. So imagine that we have an instinct in us, or a divine voice, I don't care which of those you use, an instinct within us that calls us to develop, right? That puts us on the edge And that's not the same as looking for infantile satiation or the gratification of our needs. It's genuinely this call to expand yourself and to be on the edge and to develop. That if you did that, to follow that instinct, then you'd be a blessing to yourself. Your name would become known among your people. You'd establish something of permanent significance. No one could stand before you, and it would bring abundance to everyone. Right? And then in the Abrahamic story, what happens is that as Abraham accepts that, goes out in the world, and then he has a series of adventures, each of which requires a more complete sacrifice. Because as you develop under the influence of this call, what you're required to do is to live more carefully in accordance with your expanding domain of opportunity. And that's the pathway forward. So I asked Brett about that, because this is different than the selfish gene idea, right? It's like there's an instinct within us that calls us to develop, that pulls us out into the world. And if we follow it religiously and we make the proper sacrifices along the way, then those 5 things will happen around us. And that speaks of a concordance which has to be there. It has to be there between the spirit that develops us and the pathway that brings maximal benefit to the natural and the social world. And I can't see how that can be the case. If we're adapted to the world, that has to be the case, right? It has to be that if we followed the instinct that would best put us together psychologically, this quest, this adventure, that would also be the spirit that set the world in order, right? And that spirit, that whole thing, that's what's defined as God in that particular story, right?
That resonates.
Well, I can't see, the alternative is preposterous, right? The alternative is that we don't have an instinct to develop, and you know that's wrong. You just have to watch children, and you know that's wrong. You just have to watch yourself and the curiosity that you have and the desire for novelty and for learning. You know that's there. That's what you followed to make this show, definitely. And so the alternative is that instinct doesn't exist. Well, that's a stupid theory. Or what brings you into the world is done at the expense of other people in a way that won't enhance your reputation, in a way that has nothing to do with anything permanent, right? Then it would be sort of you against the world. That would be like a power orientation. You can get your way in the world, but you have to manipulate, you have to lie, you have to use compulsion, you have to use fear. You can't just rely on the quest, say, or your adventure. And I think you can. I think you can. I think you better. Or else. There's that too.
It's interesting because you're talking about tyrants, right? And you're talking about people of extreme power and how that corrupts. And in that case, there's a large percentage of those people that are violating all those things that you said, because they do manipulate and they do rely on fear.
Well, you know, Nietzsche was an advocate of the will to power, right? So you can imagine that there's a variety of potential motivating forces, and one would be hedonic pleasure. That's the golden calf worshippers, by the way. So that's just short-term hedonism. And that doesn't work. And by work, I mean it doesn't iterate socially. It's like if it's all about you and what some whim in you wants now, right. First of all, that's not going to serve you well tomorrow. And I don't want to be anywhere near you.
Right.
Like you're literally an overgrown 2-year-old.
Right.
And that gets pretty ugly by the time you're 40.
Right.
So the whole golden calf thing, no, that's just off the table.
But isn't it kind of celebrated amongst certain high achievers, particularly in the business world, like that hedonistic, sociopathic drive to constantly get more numbers on the ledger?
Yeah, well, I don't know if that's exactly hedonism.
Greed is good. That's Wall Street, right? That's Michael Douglas, right?
Yeah,
Greed is good.
Yeah, well, okay, let's delve into that for a minute.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I'm not advocating for
I know
that,
you're
by the
not.
way.
I know you're not. You can turn to hedonism. You can fall into nihilism. You can turn to hedonism, or you can turn to power. Okay, this Abrahamic covenant, it's different than power. It's adventure. It's romantic adventure, actually.
Right.
And that's not the only definition of God in the Old Testament, by the way. There's something deeper than that it refers to. So those are the options. Now, you said, don't the achievers, who are stacking up numbers, it's like they've found a way forward to attain status, but they've fixated on an element that shouldn't be fundamental. They're not trying to store up the treasure in heaven. They're trying to store up the treasure on earth, and that's better than not doing it. See, this is another thing we need to understand, because I've spent a lot of time, for example, trying to figure out why people are attracted to Andrew Tate. And I know why they're attracted to Andrew Tate. They'd rather be Andrew Tate than an incel. And they're right? It's best to give the devil his due. Like if you had to choose between being kind of flabby and unhealthy and resentful and in your basement, looking at pornography, hating women because all of them reject you all the time and you deserve it, and you're ineffectual and the future looks pretty damn gloomy, and then you see Andrew Tate, who's tough and hyper masculine in an almost manner that's almost a parody, and wealthy and famous and apparently has women at his disposal, with a fair bit of stress on the idea of disposal. You'd think, well, I'd much rather be him than me. That's the incorporation of the shadow from the Jungian perspective. It's like,
Yeah.
it's right.
And you think about the number of men that are incels. The thing about men also, if they get rejected a lot, they associate women with pain.
Yeah.
And then they get angry at those women because those women cause them pain. Like, it's just very simple equation.
Of
And
course.
that's how you get a man hater. Or, excuse me, that's how you get a woman hater.
Oh,
and the
yeah.
same could be said for, that's how you get a man hater, right? You associate men
Yeah.
with rejection and cruelty.
Yeah.
And
Well,
you
and
think
men-
they're
and
all
men-
that way.
Young men in particular are more likely to be rejected. Young women may have difficulty finding the ideal man, but they don't face the same degree of universal rejection. So it's hard on young
Right.
men.
Well, they're not the pursuers, right, as much. The young
Yeah.
women aren't.
Right. Well, and women are the gatekeepers fundamentally of sex. So that's their essential power. That's also the power of chastity.
And that's the scary thing about acquiring wealth, is that wealth allows you to bypass the genetic social hierarchy.
Yeah,
If you
well,
could just
I
achieve-
talked to Russell Brand about this a lot. You know, women threw themselves at him. How'd that work out for him? Not great. You know, it threw him into great spiritual confusion. It was empty and hollow. And that's worth knowing, to see, because you might say to the people who are interested in the shadow figures, and Tate plays that role, the master of women, let's say, why not do that? Because you need an answer to that. If it's certainly when it's better than being lonely, isolated, bitter, and ineffectual. That's for sure.
Right.
Well, it's because you don't confuse a stepping stone with the pinnacle. That's why. There's way more beyond that. I mean, you're a tough guy. You went through your disciplinary processes on the physical side, in particular, the intellectual side too, I might add. You know, you've got what Tate has to offer, but you're what? You're respectable. Why?
Well, I
Why?
have a completely different background than him, first of all. And also, my feeling in life is whenever you can, be nice. That's like a general guideline.
Do you mean nice or good?
I mean both.
Okay.
Nice
Okay.
as well. I get the posturing. I get how it would be attractive to young men. I get it. If I was a young man, I would certainly be drawn to him, and I was to many fighters. And I accepted a lot of personality flaws in people that I admired as fighters because they were very successful at doing this one insanely difficult thing.
Right.
And oftentimes that requires a certain amount of narcissism. It requires a certain amount of internal focus. And ironically enough, not at the championship level. Ironically enough, it gets you close, but it doesn't get you to be the king. The kings are almost
Precisely.
universally disciplined, focused, and generally kind. They're some of the nicest people, the best at the most difficult thing athletically to do. And the most difficult, you're conquering
Why
other
do you think
trained
that
men.
is?
I think you have to be.
Why?
I think
Why? Why
Miyamoto
doesn't-
Musashi wrote about this in the Book of Five Rings. You must have balance in everything in life. If you have imbalance, you can get pretty far because you're so
specialized.
Right, you're so driven.
Yep.
But you will fall prey to the balanced man.
Yeah, well, that's exactly my point.
You will also recognize characteristics in him that you envy and that you wish you had yourself. Like if you're a narcissist and a sociopath, you know you are, and you can't really be proud of yourself. You can't. You don't have the benefit of the positive feedback that you get from true kindness to others. You don't have.
Well,
that.
you also know that your reputation is founded on sand. And one of the way to rationalize that is, well, everyone does that.
Right.
Everyone's like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, but then you don't trust or like anyone.
Right. And then you're really alone.
That's for sure.
You're really alone. And then if you do achieve success, it's hollow because you realize like.
So, you just outlined there the progression that Carl Jung identified as characteristic of individuation, right? With the second thing that you said. So imagine that you start an incel. Right, you're ineffectual and you're rejected as a young man. Now there are exceptions, but let's just play that out as the unhappy majority. Okay, now you look for a shadow figure to sharpen you up, to toughen you up, and to make you strive at least along one dimension, right? And so then you do that. Well, then the next thing that happens in the Jungian stage progression is, for a man, it's integration of the anima, which is the feminine part. And it's integration, it's not replacement. It's like, oh, well, then you discover the utility of empathy and compassion and kindness and mercy and care, while still being able to deal out justice, let's say. And so then you bridge that gap, and then that integration you just said, even among fighters, that's what puts them in the highest place. Right? That's right. That's right. So, but it's hard for the people. It's hard for those who are completely disaffected and also quite angry about it. The people who are interested in the pathway that Tate offers, they're not so unhappy that he's hard on women because they're pretty mad at women. And so, if it's the bitch or me, then I'll pick me. Right, exactly. And so, and it is very crucial to get this progression correct because monster's better than wimp. Right. But the question is, what's better than monster? And so it's very interesting that you made those comments on the fighting side because you wouldn't necessarily think that it would be true in that world as well.
Well, one of the best examples is your countryman, Georges St. Pierre. One of the greatest of all time. One of the nicest guys I've ever met. And if you didn't know that he was one of the greatest fighters of